semester in the Mitchell Lecture Series. Dr. Sen is Associate Professor of Architecture at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and with an honorary appointment in the Department of Art History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He co-founded a multi-campus-based research center, which is known for short as BLC, Buildings, Landscapes, Cultures, to facilitate and promote research on cultural landscapes, which is what most of his work is about. He serves on the board of the Vernacular Architecture Forum, a national organization which is dedicated to the study, preservation, and analysis of the everyday world, and also on the board of the Society of Architectural Historians. Arijit has contributed much to the discussion of cultural landscapes through publications, presentations, and significantly through a couple of edited books, which he was not so kind of pleased about when I presented them to him. But anyway, I think they're great. There's one book which is called Landscapes of Mobility, Culture, Politics, and Placemaking, which is co-edited with Jennifer Juhong, published in 2013. And then the second book, which I really enjoy as well, is called Making Place, Space and the Embodiment in the City, which is co-edited with Lisa Silverman, published by Indiana University Press in 2014. I think he's best to talk about his work. Arijit, welcome.
Is that how it goes? Okay. It's got something giant in my ears. Ooh. Thank you. So I really want to thank you sincerely for being here. And before I begin, I also want to pay my respects to the land on which I stand, the land of the Odawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and the extended land of Miami, Ho-Chunk, Sac, and Fox. So thank you, Dr. Reinders, Dr. Lowe, Ms. Sheppy, I think I'm pronouncing her right, and Ms. Moreau for your hospitality. Should I reduce this? Is there a way to reduce this somehow? Okay. Turn it off. Okay. So it's a real pleasure to speak at the Art Institute, come back again, spend time with you all. And when Henny called me, he said, talk for 50 minutes or 60 minutes. And I'm like, I will bore myself to death if it's 60 minutes. So I'm going to try hard to keep up to that, but there's a lot of clips, so don't worry about that. I am very thankful. It's a good way to end Thanksgiving break, but I'm not so sure my studio students are very thankful. It's their last week, and I just deserted them. Maybe they're not. It was hard to just walk through the mess out there, jumping across half-made models, mashed potato chips, yellow things which used to be food or maybe paste. But anyway, that's not what I'm here to talk about.
And now for something completely different.
Okay, so I want to continue what I did last December for those people who have been here and say a little more about it. In 1850, the transcendental philosophist Henry David Thoreau wrote that our perception of beauty is a moral test. Thoreau is not referring to a singular concept of beauty. He's referring to the perspective, position, and point of view from which beauty is perceived. Hence, the perception of beauty is important. As architects, architectural historians, and preservationists, we are often called upon to describe why a certain building or landscape matters, to evaluate its value. Since our judgments are dependent on economic, personal, ecological, or ideological worth, significance of a building always remains politically fraught. Aesthetics and beauty become contested terrains. Thoreau's quote centers this professional judgment that we are all so familiar with within a moral compass. Since perception is dependent on methods of seeing, this quote, and if you think about the implications of this quote, has importance for methods of interpreting the world. That is our methods, how we decide what something is worth, and how we decide it. So today I want to share with you some of these questions around beauty that I've been struggling with, and also to see beauty in the city I live in. But first, let me tell you something about myself. I am an architect without a center, a person without a place I call home. I grew up in 6 cities and 5 different states in India, always an outsider wherever I went in India, every time I moved. And now an American citizen, my diasporic and racial otherness adds to my lack of belonging in one place or a single culture. My experience underpins my research interests around meanings and representations of place, especially those representations that are not done by those who occupy the center. While architecture is about genus loci, a distinctive sense of place that is unique, permanent, geographically centered, my own sense of place is inflected by my travels. They are multi-perspectival, mutable, and often extremely disjointed. That I don't think has anything to do with my travels, the disjointed part of my thinking. That's just me. What happens then if you're not tethered to a single place, a single city, a single culture, a single value, or a single nation? It forced me to re-examine how I understand the very meaning of place. And for me, place is mobile. It is a sensory, bodily experience that I carry with me, remember, selectively retrieve from memory, and deploy in difficult situations. And I do that in order to make sense of the world around me, especially when the world becomes difficult. I describe place as inextricably connected to performance and collective memory. Now, dancers call it counterpoint, a visceral engagement between the material world, human and non-human actors, time, and other societal forces. And I've used in my work the term embodied placemaking to describe how urban places are products of such transient but nevertheless important human performances. Physical locations that I study are not just inert containers where life's drama unfolds. Rather, architecture is an active participant in this contrapuntal performance. Now, of course, when I started as an architect, I wasn't really so aware of all this. And I owe what I'm here today talking to you about to a series of scholars, teachers, architects who help me understand this. And I can return to the genealogy of thought in which I position myself later during the question-answer period if you're interested. But it suffices to say here that being an outsider also taught me that the habitual and the ordinary, which we tend to actually ignore most of the time in mainstream conversations, are important. I found that the everyday world around us, indeed, it's a site of injustice, it's a site of inequities, but it's also here that we retain our deeply held values, enact everyday resistances against structural power, and where utopian sparks ignite visionary cultural change. That is why, as an architectural and urban historian, I focus on writing urban micro-histories of marginalized communities and people, why I collect place-based stories and accounts of everyday practices that may be familiar to ordinary people, but are often missed by historians and experts. So today I'd like to tell you 2 stories about the power of the quotidian or of ordinary places. The first one will examine how mundane spaces can be sites of resistance. And the second story is about the creative potential of everyday architecture in accommodating cultural diversity. In telling you these stories, I want to make one point. And this is a very important point for the contemporary profession and the discipline. Architecture is political. No matter how many beautiful buildings we build, architecture is political. Understanding the political power of place makes us better architects. Therein lies our salvation, because our judgment and aesthetics are complicit in the reproduction of justice or of injustice in this increasingly multicultural world. Injustice is actually embedded in certain perceptions of beauty that we hold. Before I go to the stories, though, I have to tell you a little bit about Milwaukee, just so you know, unless you've been there, and I'm assuming some of you have been there. During the last 2 decades of the 20th century, this once great industrial metropolis, which would have been bigger than Chicago if the railroad lines didn't come through, pipe dreams of all Milwaukeean, located on the shores of Lake Michigan, saw really difficult times where factories and jobs left the city. Since then, the city has tried to redefine itself as a successful entrepreneurial resurgent metropolis by promoting the creative economy, knowledge and information technologies, high-end healthcare, cultural industries. You've heard all this. Here, in a color-coded map of Visit Milwaukee tourist map, the city of Milwaukee selectively represents its people and the neighborhoods in the city. While some neighborhoods are celebrated, often with colorful names and beautiful little insets telling what's in there, there's also a large section of the city, the gray zone, which is ignored. These are actually the neighborhoods where minority, poor populations live. And the stories of this, but in this map itself, the rich human stories are rendered invisible. And the funniest thing about the map is what's on the end out there, Wauwatosa, which is outside Milwaukee, some of you know is an Milwaukee suburb. It's 10 minutes away. So if we can somehow get through the gray zone, you reach, culture again. Now compare this tourist map to a map showing racial distribution. Green is for Black African Americans, blue is for white, red is Asian, and orange is Latino. And we find that I tried to make it in the same scale, but in reality what it is this gray zone and this zone really follow each other. So what you're having here is these are African American, poor, and some Asian also, Hmong immigrant spaces. Media accounts add to this kind of devaluation via a consistent singular message of negative imagery, stories around crime, blight, neglect. It encourages an aesthetic regime of privation that is associated with neighborhoods marked as gray in the tourist map. Projected neighborhood value is related to who gets to claim history, how these spaces and people are represented, and who gets to tell their story. Now, the city map is not innocent, it's purposeful, it's cruel, a real representation of how many upper and middle class Milwaukeeans feel about their city and certain neighborhoods. And since 2008, I have studied Milwaukee's flatlands, a name I coined to talk about geographies that have been flattened of its cultural, social, economic, and historical value. And it's a process by which it's done historically. Many Milwaukeeans tend to drive past these places quickly. They clutch their wallet and their purses a little closer to their body if they must have to go there. Prospective home buyers don't search for homes in these neighborhoods, fearing real estate values, low real estate values. We don't see beauty in these spaces. We only see deviance. We see disinvestment. We see apathy. We see victimhood. We see neglect. Yet, as Saskia Sassen argues, these are not isolated spaces. These spaces, the gray zones, the flatlands, mark an edge or discontinuity, and their deviance emerges out of a seeming lack of a hierarchical relationship to the larger public realm. Flatlands are spaces of silence. They're spaces of absence. So in 2008, Anna Andrzejewski, who teaches in Madison, and I co-founded a 12-year limited experiment with the goal of examining the realities of the 21st century built environment. And our focus was on the study of the fieldwork and cultural landscapes. For my focus was the study of flatlands because I was in Milwaukee. Called Buildings, Landscapes, Cultures, this collaborative project brought together Madison's art history department, UW-Milwaukee's architecture program. And in order to reach our objectives, we focused on innovative fieldwork methods to interpret our world. And as I said, how we see our methods is central to our profession and to critiquing our actions in the contemporary times. We gathered architects, preservationists, scholars, geographers, anthropologists, related disciplines, filmmakers, oral historians, to examine the built environment as an archive, the built environment as a classroom, the built environment as a discipline, architecture and space discipline, and the built environment or the field as a method of analysis, and the field as the very object of our study. This project involved undergraduate, graduate, and doctoral students and as research fellows, and BLC offerings in Milwaukee, Madison was slightly different, included a summer field school, a fall semester art, dance, and architecture studio, not the same, different ones coming together, and a spring research seminar. Our process has been very slow, 12 years. We started in 2008, so, and the field school started 2012, and we just about scratched the surface. It's been slow, iterative, and continued over multiple years. During the summer, field school scholars and students engage residents and local organizations. They conduct long sit-down as well as quick on-site interviews, conversations, storytelling sessions, history harvests, smartphone-based pop-up interviews, measurements. We actually go and measure, document, and research places of cultural relevance in certain Milwaukee neighborhoods in the gray zone that you saw in the slide before. So over 7 years, with the help of 60 students, student volunteers, numerous local residents, we collected 230 hour-long sit-down interviews, over 100 short interviews, documented 40 to 45, actually I said 5 because some of them had partially been done, buildings as material expressions of culture and heritage. Being in the field, doing this, produced transdisciplinary interactions, a bricolage of new methods, experiments with digital humanities, and crowdsourcing strategies to communicate and disseminate our stories across a wide cross-section of stakeholders. After we listen in summer, we return in fall to act on these stories. As part of the Citizen Architecture Studio, a consortium of upper-level architecture, art, dance, and design studios, our goal is to explore how interdisciplinary design practice can engage local cultures and communities. This is a quote. Tommy had worked with us for a long time, first as an undergraduate student, then in the studio, and he went on, he did it for 4 years in different capacities, and he really said, this quote I really like because he talks about a certain ritual, a ritual that every profession has. So I'm going to let you guys read it for a minute, and then, okay, so the way we do it, students research social and spatial context, groups within which they're working. And the final goal is to explore with community experts and other professional groups and to see how we can deploy grassroots knowledge to revitalize neighborhood assets. But that's not the only thing. The reality, what we are trying to do is to see how we can activate the really strong, untapped social potential that exists in these neighborhoods. We do that from all kinds of different performances and conversations, but we also learn about spatial rules. And this is something that I do want to mention if there are architecture students here. It's all fun to do good form. It's all fun to actually fly in Zaha Hadid in the middle of a dense neighborhood, and then you have a bird. But there are rules, just like social rules, there are spatial rules. And I have to say that, and I can talk about this later on this semester, it was a real dragging exercise trying to get students to understand rules, but the community really helped us really understand the very strong spatial as well as social rules within which we intervene. Borrowing methods from tactical urbanism and public interest design, a section of the Fall Studio focuses on construction of a physical catalyst. This is one assignment that we have to do, and my goal for the assignment is you cannot waltz into a neighborhood. There has to be blood, sweat, and tears. And the catalyst building, making this, involves all three of those. The idea of building a catalyst not to resolve issues through instant architectural solutions but instead, the catalyst, what it does, it allows us to see how architecture can engage users in innovative ways. So it's a communication and an engagement tool, more of a programming tool. Take, for instance, the 2018 Studio Catalyst installation, organized around 3 goals: to engage the body of the users in an experiential way, to encourage social relations within a block, and to activate community memory, cultural memory. The student organized a series of seating and planter structures around the front of Unity Orchard. In 2015, the community, with the help of the city, repurposed 3 empty lots created by the demolition of foreclosed homes. Residents renamed the lot Unity Orchard, aspiring to create a private public space where a diverse group of residents in that block and blocks around it, old, young, children, men, women, would come together as a community. So in addition to serving as a planter, seat, and play space, some of these installations had little display spaces like reliquaries, where residents then would, one of the residents was charged to go house to house, find something of value, grandma's picture, a spoon, and put it inside these reliquaries. One of them, drawing from the many roadside memorials, inscribed the name of children from that community, from that couple of blocks, who had succumbed to traffic or gun violence, and she carved it on the top, except that she made a mistake. We realized after snowfall that the plastic with the snow weight just cracked. So we learned. But to explain why we chose the edge of an empty lot to build a catalyst with these specifications, I'll need to tell you a story about that chilly day in 2017, when during a community walk, my students, community residents, and I stood at the intersection of Wright and 38th Street, located near the site of the now infamous Sherman Park uprising. Just a year ago, police shot dead 23-year-old Civil Smith blocks away from where we were standing, and the community rose in revolt. Immediately after this event, New York Times wrote, and I quote, "The burning buildings, smashed police cars, and scuffles between police officers and angry protesters on Milwaukee's North Side over the weekend might have seemed to outsiders like a spontaneous eruption, but for many in the city's marginalized black community, it was an explosive release decades in the making." Now, Fox News, though, was not that sanguine, not that thoughtful. So here, a reporter crassly sets up a local teenager with predictable questions and gets predictable, stereotypical answers. Oops, sorry.
What police say the crowd did last night was throw bricks at a county bus, toss rocks at the police, and shatter this gas station window. Shania Portis said she watched it all, but had a much different response.
Is it scary for you to watch?
No, it's fun.
What was fun about it?
Everybody else, it was live. It was fun. It was fun to me.
I'm sorry?
It was fun to me.
It was fun to you. Why?
Because it was funny. Police trying to chase after the kids and stuff.
To be sure, many other teens we met with today do not consider a park melee fun, but they acknowledge a lack of affordable extracurricular activities that would be a more appropriate and safer alternative. Melvin Gillespie has his own proposal to solve the problem.
I think the policeman and the sheriff have to show a complete show of force, and that's what these kids, the only thing they know about is force.
So I don't exactly know if it's Fox, but it's TMJ4, whatever it is, it's a national outlet. So now, and also notice how the framing was done in the questioning, just to set it up to get that answer. So as we ponder on the ominous prognosis of the Times article or listen to ridiculous questions posed by national news channels, it is important to question this assumption that Sherman Park residents stood by as hapless victims of historical injustice or were transformed into alienated mobs. During the walk, residents referred to themselves as agents of change by pointing to the centerpiece yard signs meant to represent their world as an island of calm amidst a sea of structural racism and institutional neglect. Yet, despite the yard signs, boarded up foreclosed duplexes, city-owned vacant lots, potholes, empty lots with overgrown grass, broken beer bottles, all this filled our visual field. What the residents told us was not what we saw in front of us. What we saw reiterated culturally produced perceptions of blight. These signs were familiar to us because the symbolic meanings are ingrained in us. Yet, as we learned later, what we saw was not the lived reality of the place. We found incredible diversity and vibrancy in this neighborhood, and that's part of the story coming. Wait for a minute, it'll come, the diversity. Our methods of seeing, reading the built environment by focusing on the quality of buildings and infrastructure as measures of well-being, yielded an epistemological blindness. This contradiction between what we saw and the lived reality, the visible between the visible and the invisible, is at the core of how inequality and injustice is perpetuated and established in the everyday world of Sherman Park. The long history of injustice is normalized by a process that Jacques Rancière calls the distribution of the sensible, a purposefully produced aesthetic order with implicit rules and conventions that reproduces a division between the visible and the invisible, the sayable or the unsayable. This order normalizes social inequalities and our predictable responses to these urban scenes that we encounter. This view, ubiquitous in all inner cities across the country, has been slowly normalized in our mind, in our, to stand for poverty, to stand for apathy, to stand for victimhood, atrophy. But the problem actually lay with us. Our vision, our ways of seeing, and our modes of interpreting the landscape. And so, as in the field school, we realized an urgent need to see beyond the predominant aesthetics of dereliction to recover a history that is meaningful to those who live here. During our walk, residents pointed towards a small garden patch. They called it a peace garden, and it was built by a local activist, Camille Mays. And she had built this with community members to replace a roadside memorial commemorating the death of a 16-year-old boy named Imani Robinson, an innocent bystander who was caught in gunfire at this spot. His death was symbolic of how unsafe the streets of this particular neighborhood had become. Soon after the shooting, a makeshift memorial appeared with balloons, teddy bears, and alcohol bottles marking this spot. In Milwaukee, the politics around roadside memorials have for many years escalated, and since a year ago it has escalated even more when markers appeared for Civil Smith, the person who was shot by police before the uprising and when he was murdered. An existing city ordinance allowed city workers to remove these makeshift memorials within 30 days. However, in 2016, when city workers tried to take down the memorial for Civil Smith, the crowd resisted. So in 2017, a year after, the year we were standing there, Alderman Cavalier Johnson proposed a new policy that would require roadside memorials to be taken down within 10 days. Activist Tori Lowe, who's worked with Stop the Violence campaign to end gun violence, argued, and I quote, "Some of these residents may not want things in front of their homes, but it wasn't the families or the victims' choice to die there." So these arguments that were going on were pitting the rights and interests of property owners against the collective right of mourning and memorializing the deceased by the community. So when Camille Mays offered an alternative, people really loved it. It was a total removal of, it wasn't a total removal of the makeshift memorials. Instead, it was replacing it with a garden. She did about 8 gardens between 2014 and today.
In our city, if you drive around it, it's not much landscaping in certain parts of the inner city. It's a lot of litter in our city. And one thing that stands out is it's a lot of memorials. A lot of people don't know the things that go on behind the scenes. So you have the city workers going out there removing the memorials, and then it's problems sometimes with that. And often the police have to get involved. I just think that's really a waste of time. You know, for the police to have to get involved, or for the city workers to feel unsafe, or for the homeowners to have those in front of their homes. But at the same time, I know that the family had a loss, and you want to respect all parties. And so I came up with peace gardens, which is basically landscaping at the bottom of the tree where, per the family's request or somebody who refers me over to the family, with permission, I'll remove those bottles or beers or candles, and I'll landscape with perennials and some annuals that year. And then they'll come back, and then it doesn't have to be removed. And then it just looks like landscaping. So when me or you drive down the block, we don't know, like we got a block where it was three memorials. And would you want to rent on that block or own a house on that block if you drove down the block and saw? It looks a lot better. It looks like the block is starting to do beautification. And then it's even promoted some of the neighbors to landscape their homes, even some of the renters. And so the goal with Peace Garden Project was to beautify the neighborhood and to make it something that the community could take pride in.
This clever adaptation of memorials into gardens produced an agreement first. The first success was that produced an agreement between myriad stakeholders, between the city, the property owners, the community members, young, old. But beyond seeing the peace gardens, the memorial to the wanton loss of precious lives in our community, Mays explained that by encouraging a sense of shared stewardship around an object of beauty, the Peace Garden Project became a sign of resistance against the city's abject disinvestment and a beacon, gathering neighborhood residents and family members to organize as a community. Now, the social relevance of interstitial spaces is really not new. I'm not going to play the clip just to not make it too long, but you can go to our website and there is a clip. Tremor Robinson, who's sitting here in the corner, on the side here, she said that planting flowers between the buildings, planting peace gardens, securing front yards, are all ways by which she and her neighbors have taken back their block from vagrants and from drug dealers. And she literally told us how powerful it was, but simply put flowers in front of her garden. Then her neighbor put flowers in front of their garden, and then the next door neighbor and the tenant and the whole street had flowers, and all the problems just moved away. And we didn't think of this when we went in there. We were architects. We were thinking of making major changes, and this was the simple act of caring, that power of it. So for the following 24 months, this started in 2017, for 24 months as we interviewed, documented, and examined life and material culture in this neighborhood, we saw the impact of affective solidarity generated during place-based activities on sites in between buildings. In addition to street-side memorials, other sites of everyday social action included spaces in between property lots, front of the front porch, and between the porch and the street, and along alleyways. Now, historically, these spaces played an important part in stitching together a system of spatial and social relationships that Del Upton, in the context of New Orleans, calls an architectural ecology. Milwaukee's architectural ecology was built by the 20th century understanding of economic hierarchy, race, gender, and upward mobility. Between 1900 and 1925, white working-class homeowners, mostly of German origin, built well-crafted front facades as modes of class distinction. The narrow street-lined streets were social spaces where residents walked to their nearby place jobs, to the factories nearby. They shopped in the local main street. The backyard and the stairs, too, were connected as spaces of gendered labor because that connected the kitchen, the basement, and the backyard. After the war, as white homeowners moved out of this neighborhood, new economically stable, because these are people coming from Chicago actually, but they were working class, but they had good, solid working class jobs, upwardly mobile, working class African American homeowners, despite redlining, despite segregation, maintained the social contract of the interstitial spaces. It was only after 1980s, deindustrialization and incarceration and also the loss of factory jobs totally frayed the common bonds, common class bonds, and irrevocably changed the use and symbolism of the in-between spaces. By 1990s, a proliferation of absentee landlords who were renting out these duplex apartments to poor tenants and whose turnover was very quick, a practice that Matthew Desmond argues continues to destroy the collective fabric of communities, became very common. Today, so that street I showed you, 30th Street may look like a decrepit version of the 20th century heydays, but in reality it's a very different world without shared commons. Within the architectural ecology of this neighborhood, private property lots, public thoroughfares, streets, and sidewalks are marked domains. These are places where appropriate or even transgressive behavior are culturally defined, marked, and people understand. So in other words, we know how to carry ourselves in a private property. We know how we should behave on the streets. In comparison, the medians and alleys are undefined liminal spaces that homeowners do not control, and the city ignores willfully. Turning interstitial spaces into peace garden was therefore a very politically strategic plan, because it produced what scholars like Saskia Sassen describes as a space where new forms of social and political can be made, rather than a space for enacting ritualized routines. So when during and after the 2016 uprising, city officials and law enforcement focused on their ability to surveil and control the interstitial spaces that had transformed overnight into spaces of protest, residents saw the same spaces very differently. They saw them less as territories to be externally policed, but as a locus of community gatherings, focus of block watch meetings, and sites of memory. By replacing a spontaneous memorial with a permanent one in these interstitial spaces, Camille Mays also affectively, in a very emotional way, engaged all residents around in the street around an object of beauty. And she promoted bonds among block members and generated an embodied kind of experience of space by transforming these spaces into a space of community labor, where everybody went there and did stuff. And often in this case, offered opportunity to communion across age groups.
But I think we care because we care. That's why. We care because we really care. And we care about what goes on next door and next door. And if everybody watch next door and next door, so like, if we can, we move their snow when we move ours. When we water our flowers, we water theirs. When we pick up paper, we pick up this side and that side. We care.
So the dilapidated and disinvested optics of this neighborhood may indeed be byproducts of historic injustice, but as Brahma Grice just pointed out, residents in our block go beyond this optics of helplessness towards an ethics of caring that describes an affective relationship between places and people that makes certain buildings and landscapes meaningful. What we learned from our interviews reiterated the position of political scientist Joan Toronto, who says that acts of caring offers a major alternative to the neoliberal paradigm, both conceptually as well as historically. So our catalytic installations to test a way to activate the interstitial spaces turned out to be an experiment that succeeded. Sometimes it doesn't, so all the time, every time catalytic interventions don't succeed. So by summer 2019, young adults from the neighborhood had tended flowers and vegetables in these planters, pushed by Aunt Sherry and Aunt Camille. You just can't say no to them, so they did it. Adults also used the seats for block watch and community meetings, and they also hosted a community intervention after a violent incident that happened among teenagers. So the popularity of this catalyst encouraged the design of the 2019 studio, the current studio. We returned to the community in summer and then again in fall to explore how we can learn from the catalyst that was built last year and to find out how this intervention could produce more conversations on the ground. Based on the event of 2019, students designed a water retention system with the help of local youngsters who now we know, and designed a stage that block residents wanted. They designed it because sometimes architecture students can't build everything that they design. So we're trying to change that. We engaged young engineers from Milwaukee School of Engineering who will actually complete the entire stage design by spring 2020. So just the trellis is done. Our community engaged research taught us that before we consider formally programmed design, suggest design solutions and new building programs, we should try and craft formulaic, open-ended solutions that may be understood, expanded, and contextually adapted by users. In fall 2016, I'm going back and forth in history, so I apologize for that. Graduate student Taran Singh created a participatory kit of parts modeling the architectural syntax of vernacular building. It's up on top out there. It's just literally looking at the building as structure as well as skin, and then kind of created a kit of parts. Put it together, you don't. This design tool was handed out to residents and other stakeholders, spurring meaningful discussions around architecture rules and ways that an existing building can be transformed. So in other words, you take an old duplex building, you cannot turn it into a manor house. It has to be worked within the rules that exist out there. So understanding the rules were very important for us. And we also use this in community engagement events to do storytelling sessions, people telling us how they use their homes, how they see their space in their home, but how they aspire to live in their houses. So the second story is the Order of the Fowl. It's about these ignored spaces and what it ends up doing. Are you guys okay still? Yeah. Okay. I wasn't sure I could speak that long, but hey. But in order to understand why this kit of part came about, I have to tell my second story. And it's about how people, ordinary people, create extraordinary places in very ordinary settings. Now, much of my published research on this theme, and this is what I've been working on, focuses on South Asian immigrants in cities such as New York, San Francisco, and Chicago. But all that has been written. So I want to tell you a story from my experience with Hmong immigrants in Milwaukee, a story yet to be written. Meet Cha Lor. Cha Lor is the pastor at the Salvation Church of Christ, host of ABC Hmong Radio, and a local entrepreneur. He bought 2 city-owned foreclosed mixed-use duplexes in Milwaukee's Washington Park neighborhood in 2013. And it's located along Willett Street, which is a derelict kind of commercial corridor. And Lor's building is one among many, many boarded-up buildings, mixed-use duplexes in this street. By 2013, the city of Milwaukee had more than 3,000 city-owned vacant lots and buildings that prompted the city to proactively find solutions, alternative, economically sustainable solutions for these kind of buildings that they had to take care of. So the $1 scheme allowed the city to sell vacant buildings to potential builders. And the Hmong newcomers who came in started buying up these buildings. For the last 1 decade, they've been doing that. Now, despite the relief that newcomers were helping resolve the problems of vacant buildings in the neighborhood, their appearances created some tensions. During a neighborhood group meeting in Martin Drive East neighborhood in the fall of 2015, residents complained that Hmongs rarely appear in their porches to socialize with their neighbors. Some misconstrued that by not socializing in their front porches, maybe the older generations displayed a lack of neighborliness. Now, so we started talking to various groups of people and to the Hmongs, and it suggested something completely different. I also happened to have 2 Hmong students who basically helped a lot to get into the community. Now, Lor's duplex, so in order to understand why they were not using this, we have to get back to architecture, actually. Lor's duplex was built in 1909 by John Reisner. Manuscript census tells us that in addition to John and his wife, his sister-in-law, 2 of his nieces, they all lived in the same apartment till 1930s. So small house, large families. Reisner's family used it as a 2-unit duplex until 1911, when the first floor was converted into a men's haberdashery. In 1950, the new owners converted the attic into a single occupancy unit and the second floor into 2 divided apartments. Then the lower floor served as a bakery, jewelry shop, and many other different businesses. So this flexibility of the Milwaukee duplex, explains Judith Kinney and Tom Hupka, is due to their layout. Duplexes are 2-story independent flats whose floor plans resemble a bungalow plan. They just stacked on top of each other. The interior is tripartite with a clear front, a middle, and a back section. So if you see here, you see the 3 parts. The top and bottom units have independent entrances. They're the same, and they allow different uses on both units. Now, the back of the home is connected to the service staircase that ties the attic, upper unit, and the basement. In the 20th century, when this was built, the service stairs provided a connection between storage, kitchen, and laundry, mostly used by female residents doing domestic labor. The entrance room, the living room, the dining area, both the units were the formal fronts. And in fact, when we go into these houses, we literally have fancy door handles and other forms of details, and on the kitchen side, completely normal, no decoration. So this delineates the front and back. The front is the place of formal projection of self in everyday life, and the back is space of labor. The building facade, with its predominantly gabled front, architectural ornamentation, stylistic details, bracketed eaves, these are all showing a testament to the social standing of the owner, projecting a sense of achievement to the neighbor across the street. The interior layout with the formal front and the space of labor made sense in the 20th century. This was a working class, upwardly mobile neighborhood. The place of work was walking distance. You go to the factory, come back, get a drink in the local pub, and then come home. So that was all kind of a face-to-face interaction society. And it made sense to the working class, upwardly mobile German immigrants. But this kind of significant history means not much to Charles, because the social reading of the front facade no longer serves that prior cultural, socioeconomic, political values and aspirations. The community today is diverse and heterogeneous, filled with tenants renting from absentee landlords, tenants who just move every 6 months. Many of the neighboring buildings are boarded up, vacant, economic conditions are dire. Char works on his home incrementally as funds become available, and he has been working on his home. He's transformed the lower unit to a storefront church. Then, oops, he found out that it was zoning prohibited such use, quickly went back, redesigned it, and has now plans to start a Hmong restaurant out there. Now, the interesting thing about Charles' house, and which kind of explains why the neighbors thought the Hmongs are not very friendly, is his current front and back in his house is flipped. The front room of the upper unit are used as back spaces, private rooms and offices. The front stairs are rarely used. Instead, the kitchen is repurposed into an entry hall. Visitors, family, friends enter the space, gather around the kitchen table, around food and food preparation, around acts of commensality and communal interactions. The smell of food and the sound of human chatter invigorate the back spaces. This reconfiguration of interior morphology is established by adapting the interior layout. And it's done temporarily, it's done theatrically, it's done in a very kind of performative way. Now, planners and city inspectors don't understand what's going on. They come in there, they expect Cha to maintain the house in its original form, and citing Wilson and Kelling's now popular broken windows theory, city inspectors keep giving him citations. But Charles' house is not an anomaly. We went to many other Hmong residents, Go Ling, and many other people's houses. In fact, there are some pictures here. The front door literally has a shoe rack built into it. This is the front porch used to store soil and potatoes, in fact, when we went there. So that these are different houses with shoe racks in front of there. This is actually, the lower one is Cha Laur's house. So this is a trend. This pattern is repeating itself in most Hmong houses that we study. So the neighbors were right. They were not seeing the members in the family members in the porch. The architectural morphology of the duplex lent itself to this spatial inversion, and now only in-group members could decipher how the new territorial code superimposed over a material world preserved from the past worked. So, so we asked Zhongse Wang, I'm not going to play his stuff, but he says in here that my children come back and tell me, Dad, I have a friend. I found a friend. And I say, no, Hmongs have no friend. Hmong is family. So what he's saying here is that Hmong, no matter where they live, are part of a larger extended kind of kinship. That's how they're thinking of their world. Hmong is family, he explains, the form of diasporic peoplehood that connects across geographic distances, that what scholars call community without propinquity. Laura's family has few Hmong friends and relatives living in adjacent buildings. Most of them live across the world. They, the lower set of maps have the Hmong diaspora actually across the world in United States, in Wisconsin, and in Milwaukee itself. So their world is not propinquitous. No longer squeezed in exclusionary ethnic ghettos like the 20th century Guangdong Chinese, Hmong Americans have dispersed across geographical distances in contemporary cities, and they converge in each other's house on an everyday events, for social events. It's like a wormhole into in a network world. So this form of network spatiality is what Zielinski and Lees calls heterolocalism, which is a spatial strategy by which members of certain newly arrived groups are able to sustain their identity as an ethnic community despite immediate and rapid spatial dispersion. Now, in reality, multiple cultural organizations of space coexist in this neighborhood. On the one hand, you have the top, which is the traditional street front society where the porch is a social space, and another where you have this relational diasporic space where the back gathers networked and geographically dispersed kin. The Reisners and the Bows use the front to entertain guests, boarders, and outsiders. The back zone was the space of repast and labor. In contrast, the current person who lives in there, the front zone and back porches serves as an intractable boundary between the world outside and the world of a heterolocal Hmong community.
For the Hmong community...
Sorry, you don't have to hear this. So what we learned is that the drama of life inside buildings engage people, their memories, their cultural practices, and the built environment in ways that are very powerful, but they're not invisible or obvious to us. So Tarrant's kit of parts emerged from this understanding, that the architectural flexibility of vernacular buildings is the real significance of this building. It's not the stylistic part. This architectural quality is actually rendered invisible when we focus on architectural styles, when we focus on materials, when we focus on normative notions of beauty. In an article titled Promoting Cultural Preservation, Randall Mason argues that cultural values that govern qualities like beauty, feeling, meaning, symbolism, qualities that an economist would call non-use values, are important. But does the world look different if we learn to focus on cultural values of the quotidian? It does. Our engagement with ordinary people in everyday places generated new ways of seeing Milwaukee. Underground research associate Bella Biwer produced this map documenting places that matter to residents and community members. Robert Runstrom calls these counter maps because they are made from alternative local knowledge, narratives made in opposition to representations produced by powerful interests, be they from the state, the private sector, or elsewhere. This map is accessible via smartphone. It lets us hear residents explain the history of the church, or to describe the relevance of the Black Men's Network opposite the church. Camille Mays tells us how she works to create these memorials. Or Sherry Fuqua tells us how residents take a vernacular duplex and create intergenerational mixed-use housing. So, and this is not the only map. This was created by us through our kind of community-led walks. But there are maps that come out of the community, counter maps. Maps of local gardens printed in different languages, here in English and in Hmong. Recasting vacant lots marked by the city as devalued property as sites of productive value. The map locates a rich landscape of art lots, front yards, orchards, farmers markets, Hmong grower spaces, community gardens in this neighborhood. But perhaps the most powerful story, which I'm not going to play for you, I can play for it later on, comes out of the student of mine, Hiram Stokes, is the intangible and mapping the ephemeral aspects of the neighborhood. So what he did, he was from this neighborhood, and he said, you know, the problem with UWM middle class, non-black scholars like me going into the neighborhood is I always happen to be in the neighborhood during the daytime. And the world is very different. I actually want to play this, if you don't mind. So I said, okay, Hiram, walk down your streets and tell us what it sounds like. So he did this.
I hear these sirens every day.
I don't even know whether this is a siren.
Brothers riding through the streets with dark tinted windows, dark cars. When they drive closer to you, they slow down a little bit. I guess that's their way of checking to see who you are. They see you're not paying attention.
So notice the background noise and the way it changes.
Brothers out here playing basketball. I love this. It's nighttime. They got the court in the street. Shirts off. One guy got boxing gloves on. Hear the blues in the background. It's beautiful.
So as he was walking down Vliet Street, he was mapping a socially vibrant, diverse world, discovering empty lots transformed into loud basketball courts, sidewalks turned into playgrounds, stoops reoccupied as social spaces. The urban soundscape was rhythmic. It was framed within the rumble of goods train, and that's why I actually like doing this here. It's the same, the trains going by and then the cars going by, and within that, punctured within that, this extreme life that comes out at night in the neighborhood. Now each of these maps contest the official single story of decline and aggregate. They appear as a counter-narrative to the map of Milwaukee, which I began during the beginning of my presentation with. Community leaders use these maps to introduce new tenants, block watch members, homeowners to their neighborhood. In fact, the story map was invited, they were used by the community to invite the mayor to come in and get a lecture from them. So this year, we got invited to join a national traveling exhibit called Climates of Inequality, produced by the Newark-based Humanities Action Lab. That exhibit will come to Chicago. It'll come in fall 2020. That's the one. This is not, it'll come to Chicago because UIC is part of it too. It's an exhibit, digital platform, and international programming that is put together by advocates, community members, scholars of more than 500 students across 20 different cities. They represent a unique collaboration between universities and frontline communities from Newark to New Orleans. Our common goal was to launch a memory project, a memory movement around environmental justice, and share strategies of collective transition from extractive environments to generative ones. Our contribution titled Urban Blight as Environmental Injustice is about Milwaukee's North Side neighborhoods. We argue that if we learn to see things differently, we discover valiant stories, we discover powerful ways of acting in this world. actions that will ultimately change us. It'll change the way we think about our profession and the way we think about civic resistance. Our frontline communities has much to offer us, and we need to figure out ways to listen and learn from them. This experience has also led me to many other collaborations, which I'm not going to go into, but I can come back to it later on. So I want to end with, so what happens if we rethink what we value, recover the voices of who are otherwise rendered marginal, and discover an otherwise invisible world of beauty and human agency? What happens then? We act differently. We transform from being merely researchers into citizens, citizen architects, dedicated to understanding our past and to build a better future. Our alternative stories challenge the rhetoric of flatlands as an empty slate, a tabula rasa that developers, industrialists, capitalists, and planners rush in to redevelop. I'm speaking of a kind of engaged practice where we use local knowledge to empower citizens and encourage transgressive acts that Jacques Rancière calls aesthetics of politics, or the politics of aesthetics. Writing such histories, though, requires to see differently, to identify what remains invisible, to explore new methods, to co-theorize with local experts, and to acknowledge alternative aesthetic practices. In these histories so written could well become catalysts for transformative social change. Perception of beauty is and can become a moral test. Thank you. That was long. So questions?
Yep, we're going to open the floor up for questions. If anyone has any, please raise your hand and I will bring you the microphone.
How did growing power affect your work? And growing power was almost simultaneous with your activities. Will Allen's now unfortunately defunct agricultural experiment with the city of Milwaukee.
Yeah, what Will Allen did was more than Will Allen itself, because he transformed the way a lot of people in Milwaukee started looking at. So Sweetwater Organics came up and all kinds. So in the Washington Park and Sherman Park area that I work in, community growing is very important for many reasons. There are the Hmongs who actually are growers, so they have been growing stuff. But then there are also local local residents who predated the Hmong who had also been growing, because that's one thing that's common within older generation African Americans as well as Hmong. So I have a story where this Hmong elder actually shares a garden patch with an African American elder. They don't speak to each other, but they know what to do with their gardening, and oftentimes have misunderstandings, but growing becomes the way to bring people together. So growing power, Will Allen still exists, but Will Allen has moved into that ether of important people. What has happened is this notion of growing has become central. Sherman Park used to be a food desert. Right now, there are little lots coming up. In fact, those planters that you saw was Miss Fuqua wanted the planters because she wanted planters in each of the blocks and people growing food for their blocks. So it has transformed Milwaukee, and that's really the core power, I feel, food justice has become in the city.
Thanks for sharing such inspiring work. Very exciting to learn about it. I just have a couple of thoughts. One thing that sprang to mind in your discussion of the peace gardens, which are obviously really successful and transformative, is that I feel a little bit sad that the initial expressions of bringing objects which are beautiful, which are meaningful, which are important on many levels and so forth, are seen as unsightly by some, so that those have to disappear. And I know that in so many instances around the country and around the world, that those kinds of initial actions then sometimes turn into incredibly beautiful artistic statements. So I guess I just would love to see a way that aspects or fragments of those could live on and not be completely replaced. And one other thing that sprang to mind, it's more of a a conundrum and maybe not even an answerable question, but the work that you're doing with these interstitial spaces is so important. But I'm aware of the work of Desmond and the incredible epidemic of displacement of people in Milwaukee due to evictions. And I wonder if anyone's tracing where those people go, and if your program somehow deals with people that are just kind of erased.
So the first question is a good one. And you know, in South America or in Ireland, for instance, these roadside memorials become art projects quickly. And sometimes in South America, it's also religious reliquaries. But it's contextual. What happens in the US, in cities like Milwaukee, is that particular visual is associated with crime and death. And I'll give you a personal example. When I first did my field school in that neighborhood, there was this one street, 38th Street, which had about 4 or 5 memorials. And I went, I take a bunch of suburban kids in there. I just got scared. I didn't do 38th Street the first year. I did 40th Street. And then I realized it was all traffic accidents, not like people shooting each other. But that's what it is. That's the distribution of the sensible. And so that's one thing. So it might not work in conditions where we are used to associating with death and mourning with crime and deviancy. So that's one. But the second thing, which is also important, is a lot of American cities have rules against actually taking these down because people hang out in these places. They just go there, and homeowners complain that they can't sleep. There is they're drinking outside, they're smoking. So it really becomes this fight between homeowners versus the right to the city, the public realm. And so there was no way out because Alderman Cavalier Johnson, he made it 10 days instead of 30 days. So in a way, this was the only option that she had. But yeah, that's what it is. The other thing is the city removes it because the teddy bears and the balloons, they get really dirty after some time. So yeah, it's a conundrum. And I think what's going to happen with Camille is she's going to experiment with the gardens because the gardens have changed too, and I haven't talked about that. They moved from being a plot of garden land to I forgot the word she uses, but it's this kind of little world that she creates out there. So it has become more and more elaborate. The second question, which was on, what was that? Oh yes, the evicted part. So what's interesting about eviction, I have to say that Matthew Desmond has a very interesting picture of what happens with evictions is the city comes in and they would take all your stuff if you do not move it, and they'll put it exactly in that median strip. So the median strip is in these neighborhoods where evicted people's stuff is left over. Desmond has said that he's traced a few of them. One of my undergraduate students just recently graduated. She's actually been tracking people who were evicted. They usually go to a worse place, end up being homeless, simply because once you're evicted and it's on your records, the next homeowner doesn't give you a place to stay. So it just goes downhill, and they go to, and they're oftentimes mothers with kids. So it is actually, Desmond points out that just like incarceration is the black males population has been decimated by that, African American women are really the primary people who are hit by eviction in these neighborhoods. Tiana, who's my student, actually has been following up on some people who were evicted, and this happened because one of our field school places, we walked into an evicted house. And that was the most incredibly powerful impression that my students and I had ever had, because eviction necessarily means you just leave. And your grand piano, your family Bible, your checks, and your, everything is there for us to reconstruct. We did reconstruct someone's entire life, going all the way back simply by collecting stuff from the evicted landscape. So that got Tiana really interested, and she's back now kind of trying to figure out if she can find people to interview. I didn't do that because I have to go through very strong IRB requirements, and that was something which just didn't have time for, so we didn't do that.
Hi. So I'm curious as to whether or not these types of studies and examinations of space and what happens to spaces, the same emphasis that's put in urban environments, if people looked at it in a rural context. You know, I've lived in Chicago for 30 years, so longer than when I lived downstate, but you can see Blight in Cairo, Illinois, that could far surpass what you would see on the west side of Chicago.
Yeah.
So just curious as to...
I haven't done it, but the BLC program, that when it started, it had two branches. It had Milwaukee and Madison. Madison, you know, we just joke, Madison's really not a city. They pretend it is.
Oh. See,
sorry.
for us, downstate, Madison would be like Chicago. I'm really talking about towns that
I'm talking
used to
about
have 1,500 people and now have 200.
So the Madison folks would do their field school in places like Mineral Point, and so those are real rural places. And but the thing is, their program, because we were in a city, we were doing field schools, and I didn't plan any of this out. I started a field school. I was a simple-minded guy who wanted to just do what architectural historians and preservationists do: go and document buildings. But when you document buildings in a city, especially in a neighborhood which has a history of disinvestment, then there is an ethical component to it. You cannot just waltz into someone's neighborhood, measure their houses and say bye and walk away, and they actually told me that. So we started staying there for longer. We also made the field school a public history field school, so we had oral histories and such. Once we did that, that's when we actually got into the issues that go into the neighborhood. We were there for longer. We were there for at least 3 years. Madison, on the other hand, they do actually document these spaces, but they simply document it as places, building types. And they do some interviews, but they do it only for one summer. So they do have interviews of real distress that's happening in places, small towns, but not for longer. I mean, if we stay there for 3 years, I'm sure we'll have a much more stronger story, but not us. We don't do it. But you're right.
Why would they not study there for 3 years as opposed to studying for 3 years in Chicago or Milwaukee or whatever? I'm just curious. Is it a financial thing? Is it?
It's a city thing.
City of population?
It's a city thing, but I also think it's, I'm just going out of my limb to say that, but academia also has an urban focus, especially in architecture, urban studies, and So we would go to cities, architecture schools and urban studies and urban planning schools. So I guess, I mean, there must be people doing it. I'm sure Rural Studio does that. So there are places where they're doing it. It has to be in a setting where you could do it. Like in Milwaukee, we look at the city. That's our lab. But in Oklahoma or in Auburn, where Rural Studio is, they do go into rural communities. There was a question out there.
Thank you for your presentation and your work. Your presentation brings a lot of questions, more to come later. But I just had to, since we're in a school, an academic environment, and you're from one, and I'm happy you mentioned the IRB. I'm really interested in sort of how this plays out in an academic context, right? So one, just the aspect of time, right? So you've talked about a longitudinal sort of body of work and practice. What does that look like in terms of a quarter system or semester system? Yep. And we have those issues in academic settings, right? To take on community work requires a sort of longer term commitment.
Yes.
That's one piece. And then the second, quick question is around, I'm curious, because you're doing so much participatory research, I'm curious how the folks you've worked with sort of come or sort of developed as further researchers. And so things that you all have done together, I'm curious, what are they sort of bringing back to the table as well, that maybe the university and your students are learning from as well?
Yeah. So the first one, which is actually important, that was the biggest problem we have. We have different time cycles. We have our semester cycle. Our work comes to an end in like the end of semester, and the people in the neighborhood like, what happened to you guys? So that was a big problem. The only good thing, though, is I realized I used to stress a lot on that. Now, just to back up a little bit, I didn't go there for a research project. I have to share this. I went into this neighborhood because I didn't feel at home. I've been in this country since 1987, and I always felt like I'm this guy who's doing research, teaching. So I don't even know how it happened. I just went in there, and I just felt, oh my God, this is just like back in India. Everybody sits and chats. They're not just doing their thing for like 9 to 5. They're not scheduling interviews. So that's how I started doing that. It was completely for personal reasons, but it turned into this long project. So getting back to the time thing, what we do is, what we have realized as against design charrettes that planners do, our case, it's a very long-term incremental exercise. And it's created an archive. That's what happened. And the archive and I are the only two, we are the visional people who just sit around in the university, and the students just keep going and coming. Some students, the undergraduate students, I get them when they're in the first year, and they're incredible. They stay there for 4 years. By the end of it, they're actually writing research papers, going out and presenting. So that's the continuation. And now we have all this stuff I said, which is, oops, I did something, but that's okay. We have all this stuff which is now a community archive. And that has turned a whole new leaf into our project, which is temporarily different. So what the students now do, the spring semester class, which is a research class, students will actually listen to the archive and try to make sense of it. Now, the question of, what was the second one?
Just thinking about, because you're doing so much participatory research with
yes.
community members, I'm curious how they develop that.
Yes.
Further develop the research, because obviously they have a ton of knowledge.
So yeah, it goes both ways, and we have both been transformed. The method I used is what cultural anthropologists called engaged kind of participatory ethnography, and collaborative ethnography, Eric Lassiter calls it. And what that means is it's a very, very long process where the people in the neighborhood are co-authors. And I have to be respectful of their time. So I can't just give them a piece of paper like I'd give to my colleagues and read it tomorrow. So we have to work for a long period. So Camille Mays, who's been working with me for 3 years, recently went to the Climates of Inequality Humanities Action Lab event. She was the representative, not me. She and a few students of mine. I was in some other place. So she went there and she talked about the project. What happens is I've realized that two things that we have come to see how it impacts our community partners is the language. First of all, they frame this issue in ways that then gets the attention of the city politicians and so on and so forth. I'll give you a very simple example. There was a house in a neighborhood which had a bad absentee landlord, had a mold problem, and they would go regularly to the city to complain about the landlord, and the city said it's private property, can't do anything, till they found out that public health is the language that they have to use. Immediately public health worked. So what Camille told me is, your students are learning something from us, we know that. What we are getting from you are documentation, ways of perception, and so on and so forth. For a long time, also, the other thing is I was very tired of architectural studios where we make pretty buildings and these little doll houses which no one ever uses. I've been doing this for a long time. My students not, but me, yes. So I got tired of it. But then Camille told me that, you know what, dreams have a part to play. You might be tired of the dreams because you want the dreams to become real, but we like the dreams because it gives us a place to go. So that was it took me a while to recognize that. But it is powerful, and it is powerful if you respectfully understand that way. So those are ways it has worked, but this garden map that I just showed you was a very unintended, most of the learning that happens from the community point of view is unintended events that turn into this. Because we did the walk, which you saw the first map, which used to be houses and places, the community leaders whose houses we measured decided to the garden one. And this was completely theirs with the Washington Park Community Association. So kind of talking about their neighborhood as a network of valuable spaces is something that I think our collaborative work produces. And that for me is very powerful. It's this thing about the perception of beauty is a moral test for me. There was a question. Oh, he's gone.
Thanks. This was really interesting. So I mainly do art criticism, but I've been increasingly interested in architecture criticism as a way of getting at issues like redlining or eviction more directly. And I guess I'm curious about what roles you see a more public-facing architecture writing playing in socially engaged design and architecture projects, if it can have some role that goes beyond just sort of highlighting projects that are interesting, but if it can actually assess the efficacy of projects or participate in some of the research.
So on the one hand, you have research and social science work, which actually could be evaluating events, things that happen in the neighborhood. So that's one aspect of research that a lot of people do. We don't do this in the field school, but they could go and look at events, revitalization or some kind of policy and its impact on the neighborhood. So that's the evaluative part. For me, what's more important though, is the human, the emotional part. And that is the harder one to look at. So I went to the biennial today, and there was, first of all, it just made me really happy because it was a full 180. Architects don't do things halfway. They're either doing a biennial where it's all pretty pictures, or they just go all the way back here and they're doing things which make you depressed at the end of it. I was happily depressed. And it was a really nice depression that I had when I saw the reality. But there was one thing out there which was about Merton's experiment on sociability, like basically a very social sciencey experiment. And I was thinking, why don't I do that? Because I was trained to do that. I was trained in environmental psychology and environmental building environment studies. I don't do that because I think the problem with reducing that kind of evaluation work is in order to evaluate anything, it seems like you have to reduce this to be evaluatable variables. And the problem with human beings is that they never stick to evaluative variables. So instead, what we do is what Clifford Geertz calls thick description. And what thick description allows us to do is to get into the contradictory, nuanced, but extremely frustrating humanity of people. And so I was just, this is my brain. It was like, oh my God, that's useless stuff. That's humanities, that's what they say about humanities. But I think that's where the power lies, because what I learned in the neighborhood, and this is something that architecture criticism could do, is to be able to talk about the power of these affective qualities, caring. And we went in talking about social justice. That's the thing that you hear all the time. Mavis, who lives in the block, she looked at me and said, the problem with you guys in the university, you always think that we're standing in the backyard talking about race, gender, class, and social justice. We don't. We're talking about whether our plants are growing, if there is crash on the thing, and we talk about caring. And that's where we got. Then we came in and we found there's a whole feminist literature on caring as a social practice. So I think what architectural and architectural criticism can allow us to do is to get into that aspect of space where the performance I talked to you about in the beginning, that performance between this counterpoint between people, the environment, and values, and history and time. That very complex thing can only be written, and can be written in language which is evocative, which is not about the evaluative kind of thing, where you take variables and measure, but here you describe. So those are the two options I can think of that in my work I come across. And I tend to go towards the kind of thick description aspect. Because we don't, never mind, I shouldn't say that. I'll say that. We haven't really solved world's problems by being scientific social science researchers. Sorry about the long talk, okay? That was all Dr. Heinder's fault.
Arijit, thank you again. I'm curious about, if you think about the simple idea that when people come first and a settlement comes out of the coming of the people, like what you would see in an informal settlement, where there's no building fabric, there's vacancy or space in it that allows people to arrive or to claim space and then create structure. If there is any evidence within, the landscapes that you guys are investigating, where there is an alternative mode of occupation and claiming ownership and belonging through strategies where the people arrive and use their collective caring to claim space and create new intersections of borders or thresholds that extend beyond what we see when we look at that grey spot on the map. We tend to describe the visual built fabric first, and then try to figure out, whether the culture exists and whether the people and the power of the people exists. And I'm curious, are there evidence, specifically in the US, where alternative strategies allows people to take place and then create a foothold for themselves?
Yeah, I believe they're there. So Milwaukee in 2020 summer will have this big circus. DNC is coming to town, Democratic National Convention. So we were thinking about the DNC coming and how the same script will be written, the script of place coming first and then people being impacted by it. So the whole this thing about this new city, streetcars, and just basically glitter like this. And that's going to be about the visuals. And what's going to be hidden is another world which actually is not captured by the visual, essentially, or the material sometimes. So I feel, having grown up in a developing nation, one thing that I'm aware of is that, first of all, one thing that I'm totally aware of is there's the fourth world in American cities. So American cities may be the first world, but really there are many worlds in there. And that got completely solidified. I was sure after I worked in North Side for a while, is that there are ephemeral worlds that are emerging. It's an emergent world that is not so much about the physicality, but it's about the performance. So we are having this person called Abu Malik Simon, who basically writes on South African cities and Southeast Asian cities, where he talks about this emergence, this kind of constant possibilities that are there, even though there is a physical structure. So there is the physical structure of Nigerian cities, for instance, but the two guys on the street corner getting to meet each other and then coming up with something is something that you cannot capture in a map. That exact same thing happens in the inner cities of Milwaukee. And I don't know if that's a product of economic power or not, but for instance, the garage. None of the garages that we went does have cars in there. They do all kinds of stuff in the garage. Of course, most in the store, but some of them are doing their car mechanics work. Now that's illegal. Because how it's the kind of spatial transformation you're talking about is stopped in Western cities by zoning, by this kind of regulation and policies of separating different activities and people and places. There's a certain mentality of separating functions, kind of a modernist mentality. But that's not real in people's lives. So there are things that are happening which produces emergent spaces. So the alley, which every time I have a review session, all the architects are really against the alley and they're like, oh, don't do anything. But the alley is the place where things, both good and bad, is happening. Same with, so those interstitial spaces. But it's not just interstitial spaces. We also found that duplexes, which had a completely different function, is now transformed into intergenerational houses. That grandma lives downstairs and children live upstairs. So there are these internal. These are not what you were saying. You were talking about much more emergent forms of urbanism that happens in, say, shanty towns or informal settlements and so on. But here, even within the house, there are informal stuff that's going on. So that world does exist. I'm not so sure how to answer your question because that's really the focus of my research. Is I want to see if there is an emergent world that is actually lying hidden because we are so used to seeing opticentric, visual-centric, material-centric spaces. I think there is. I've seen it, but I don't know how to actually say. Like the Hmong people turning the front door into a shoe rack. Those are examples of that, but I don't think I have the word, like the language to say that to you yet, answer that.
I get to use your microphone. So these site histories that you've developed are primarily focused on the recent past, and you gave sort of compelling, just the examples you gave are like tremendously compelling arguments why that's probably more relevant. It's also probably much easier to access that information because the people are still around. But did you ever feel somewhat conflicted because the physical resources that you're dealing with are oftentimes late 19th century or early 20th century, and that's what you're looking at? So is there the visual and the historical, because the historical deals with the recent past, did you ever feel like you needed to peel back the onion a little more to look at the base layer to see why the forms are what they are, and then maybe how the recent inhabitants have modified or used it?
Yeah, that is something that I've done in Devon Avenue. You have to come to Devon Avenue to walk with me to do that. Usually what I do, my methodology that I've been using is temporal. There are time scopes, as I call it. So you start with environmental time. That's really what sets things up. So if you go to Devon, and I'm going to go to Devon because that's where I've done this. I haven't done this so much in Milwaukee. It's just beginning. In Devon, if you walk up Devon, going towards Rogers Park, which is near the lake, you come to a ridge, and then you go down. It's called Ridge Road. Ridge Road goes from here all the way up north to Wisconsin, and it used to be a Native American settlement path. It was on the ridge between the lake and the hinterland. And so the ridge has been an environmental space which was then used as a path connecting what used to be a Native American settlement in the place we call Chicago all the way to Wisconsin. And that grew, and then the Luxembourgians came, and the Germans came in later on, and West Ridge and North Ridge and West, oh God, I'm forgetting. West Ridge and Rogers Park. Those two neighborhoods are on two sides of the ridge, and they have totally different histories. And that's an example of like historic environmental time has differentiated these two neighborhoods in the way they grew. Even the land, the Luxembourgian farmers doing farming, all that stuff. Then you have historical time, which is where I'm working on. So in historical time that we are looking at in the neighborhood of Sherman Park, for instance, goes up to Native American settlements, and then it goes, because some of the streets, angled streets in Milwaukee, actually were Native American trails. So the history does get back to that. And the name Milwaukee, all that stuff. So that historical time then goes into the 19th century industrial time. So if you really look at it as telescopic, then the immediate notion of performative time is actually based on this kind of environmental time. They're very interconnected. And the only way I can talk about that is the same way I can talk about structural problems versus individual problems in the neighborhood, is to basically do comparative work. Like, so when my students go from one neighbor to another, they start seeing patterns. And it's the patterns which help them see the larger argument. I was just talking to Carla today. I said, if I have a class in Milwaukee which is looking at whatever is happening in the neighborhood, you do a class in Chicago, then my students will actually say, oh my God, this same thing happens in Chicago? And then you go into the larger question of capitalism and whatever the economic issues are. So in the same way, when you actually begin to see similar road patterns, for instance, cities, the kind of angular roads, you ask those questions, it turns out to be oftentimes Native American paths, which used to be there way before the settlements happened. So those are ways we are, and that's actually the monograph that I have in mind that I want to write about Milwaukee, has these temporalities that coexist. And Milwaukee River and the lake are the two main spaces, two main environmental impacts on the way the land was settled. So you might have heard, for instance, Waukesha wanting water from Milwaukee because they have just basically used up all their groundwater. But it's on a ridge. And this side is the lake side of Milwaukee is on the lake side. Waukesha is on the other side of the ridge. So the water, which if you keep taking water from the lake and give it to Waukesha, in a few years, God knows what's going to happen to the lake if everyone starts doing that. So that was the lakes contract that all these Great Lakes cities have. So that also begins to explain how Milwaukee and Waukesha, in fact, literally now, if you go from Milwaukee to Waukesha, there's a line. The road has potholes on this side of the line, and on the other side of the line is smooth as silk. That side is white, this side is black, that side is rich, this side is poor. It has a history to it. And so that's where those historical things come in, is that environmental landscape played a part. It's not direct, but it did play a part in the way this city came across. That's about all I have. I mean, because the other fun stuff that I have is manuscript census. So one of my students, and my students are really good at this. There was a student who was in English, and she was doing that. I said, you know what, aren't you just tired of, do some creative writing with this. So she went back with a bunch of manuscript census of a street, working class street next to Harley Davidson's factory. And she basically, you can recreate through Sanborn maps and manuscript census exactly what was going on in the street, who lived there and how many pubs there were, and then a little bit of imagination, you can figure out who's coming to in the evening and where the men are, where the women are, and so on. And so she started finding these love affairs that's happening in these houses, because if you look at housing, if you look at these what are they called? Tenants in these houses, single tenants in these individual houses. In the next 10 years, Mr. Eggers, his name was like one of these guys' names with Mr. Eggers. Mr. Eggers gets married to somebody who lived next door. And in the next manuscript census, both of them actually are in another apartment together. The third manuscript census, Mr. Eggers dies, and she's the widow of him. So she starts like imagining this world that happened in, this is more recent actually, not as, so those can be done in manuscript census. It's a lot of fun. Most of my students wouldn't do that because they just get daunted by the fact that they have to look at manuscript, they have to look at handwritten script. That's daunting.
Thank you, Arijit, very much. Just join me in one
Thank
more
you.
round of applause.
Thank you very much.